Fantastic. All right, well, welcome everybody, and thanks everybody for joining us today. My name is David Hartman. I'm a Managing Director of Accountability and Authorizer Supports at SchoolWorks, and I'm joined with my colleague, Sarah Rapay. She's another Managing Director at SchoolWorks, and so we'll be the hosts for this. I'll kind of facilitate most of the conversation, then Sarah will wisely jump in with anecdotes as needed. But we really appreciate you joining us for this time because it's a unique time in education and in all of our lives. And we just are excited to take a little bit of time to have this conversation with some experts from the field. Nobody here has the answer, no offense to everybody, but we're all working through this together and we feel like it's a valuable conversation to have, and we're really curious to hear some of your questions or see some of your questions in the chat as we walk through this. Some logistical things that I've noted previously. There's a chat function, pull that up. That'll be the primary way for you to send questions. We'll try to respond sometimes live within the chat. Other times we'll bring those questions to the panelists themselves. So all of us will be able to see that generally while we're walking through that. I have a series of questions that I'll be asking, and we'll kind of walk through that, but we will certainly try to open up to some of the questions that you pose in the chat later on in the conversation. In terms of our images, as I noted before to a question, just the panelists are up for this because we have too many faces that'll cover the screen if we don't. So you'll be seeing us and you can, have salad in your teeth all you want during this next hour and not have to worry about it. So why don't we get going with this? So Sarah and I, we talked about ourselves. That's my old picture when I had hair. And SchoolWorks itself, SchoolWorks is an education consulting organization that's been around for about 20 years. We work in public education through traditional districts, public education, and in the charter space and authorizing world. We work on evidence-based program evaluation, planning, intervention support, and monitoring. And we've supported schools, like I said, for over 20 years, and we really help them to ensure that quality in the schools in their own portfolios. So what you see here are kind of the 5 areas that we focus on. I won't elaborate on them, but more than happy to follow up if you have questions about us, or you can go to our website. So why did we even come here today? So basically for the last 14 months, the pandemic has affected all of us and our academic data. And the thing that I've said to all of these people is that, like the reliability of real estate value pre-2008, the housing crisis undermined confidence in housing investments, and basically people who were invested knew that they had to diversify their portfolios. And so in the last 14 months, what we've learned in the absence of state assessment data is that schools and authorizers learned that they needed to diversify the academic performance data that they're collecting and considering when thinking about their own school, or in the case of authorizers, when considering the quality and the performance of the individual schools that are within their portfolio. So one of the things that all of us on this call here are relatively familiar with, but not experts. So everybody's familiar with Nwea assessments. And so the experts here, Jason, Aaron, and Chancey, all have access to that and use and rely on that in some capacity. So for those of you who are aware of it, last spring, NWEA had come out with a report in which they predicted what the COVID learning loss would be relative to summer learning loss, and thought that it would be quite profound. And then in November, there was a report that came out from them that actually was in some ways more positive than expected, in that ELA scores did not drop at the rate that they expected. So there was less learning loss due to the pandemic in ELA in a general sense. However, in math, There was a learning loss. Thank you, Sarah. There's a link to the study there from November. There was learning loss in math, and it was more profound in some grades than others. More nuance-wise, and I won't go into it, as you look and break down the demographic groups, they started to notice that there are some groups that had more of an effect, and so did not track as positively or against the norms as expected. So there's some good data there to consider learning loss. One of the things that is considered in this conversation is that, yes, there is learning loss, and that we all have to deal with what it is, how much it is, and how to consider the data when moving forward into the post-pandemic times. So for the sake of this conversation, I'll do a little introduction of everybody and help you understand who they are. And they'll have a little bit of an opportunity to talk about themselves and how they've addressed things. But I've asked each of them to come to this conversation with a little bit of information just about the context of their network, their portfolio of schools, and then these 3 bullets that I have up on the screen. So basically, what academic performance measures have changed since the start of the pandemic? So what adjustments have you needed to make? And what have you learned about learning loss? I don't think anybody definitively can say, I know about learning loss. I think people know some things about learning loss. So really curious to hear what everybody has to say about that. And then thinking about the future. And so how have you used or been required to change your expectations? So back to that housing issue and diversifying your portfolio. So thinking about the academic data that you accumulate, how have you had to change the information that you accumulate or the expectations that you have and the data that you rely on in order to think about the future? So with that, let me just take a second and introduce everybody. I have the honor of having this great team with us on the panel today. So we have Erin from DC Public Charter School Board, and she'll be kind of starting us off and talking a little bit about those 3 things. Chancey Anderson is the co-founder and CEO from Prodeo Academy in Minneapolis, and Jason Sarsfield is Deputy Director at Central Michigan University, who's an authorizer of, and he'll be able to say how many schools are in the portfolio. But Erin, if you don't mind, telling us a little bit and kind of going back to these 3 questions.
Great, thank you so much. I'm happy to kick us off. As Dave mentioned, my name is Erin Kupferberg and I work at the DC Public Charter School Board. My work focuses on academic oversight. We are the sole authorizer in Washington, DC, and we oversee 128 schools, which is about 46,000 students, or about 43% of the student public school attending student population. We are a little unique that we authorize schools beginning in pre-kindergarten 3 all the way through adult education. So we have kind of a wider scope of schools we oversee. Our current accountability system, or the one that we've been using up to COVID, focuses mostly on the state assessment. And for Washington, DC, that's the PARCC assessment. For our older grades, meaning 3rd grade and up, schools selected assessments for early childhood grades, and mainly NWA MAP has been the most popular one in the past. And our high school framework also includes assessments like PSAT and SAT. For changes for the last 1.5 years, we've tried to focus on being flexible. When school buildings physically shut down in spring 2019, we asked our schools to do the impossible and figure out how to educate students without being in the school building. And so we stopped data collection at that point. We didn't collect any data. We didn't collect any year-end assessment data because schools really needed to shift the focus on how they're going to educate their students. And then through that next summer, the information kept changing, but school essentially for most of our schools started virtual in the fall of 2020. So our guidance to schools again was flexibility. We guided them that they had to assess all students, but they could choose the assessment that was most beneficial for their program. And that wasn't always the assessment that they had given us data on. And we knew we would not be getting as much data as we would like this year, but that was really important in this virtual and ever-changing atmosphere. We will be collecting the data that is available for this last year. We know that a lot of schools were not able to assess the students or collect their goals data how they normally would, and there's no penalty for that. The data we are going to use is just to see how students are doing when it's available. We won't be using it in high stakes decision making. So it again was a year just to get through this year in the best possible ways so we can provide some flexibility, but school leaders have been talking to us continuously about what they did do, what they're seeing with their students, and how they know their students are doing. Which leads to the learning loss question that we don't have as much information as we would like. Obviously, our state assessment was canceled for the second year in a row. So 2 years without state assessment data leaves our accountability system definitely not applicable. We won't be producing one this year. For our schools, what they're telling us is that early childhood grades, the fall virtual testing data was not very informative. I think we had a mix of students who weren't able to take the test, and we had a mix of parents who were very helpful with their students taking the test. So the data was very mixed. And I think NWA MAP came out and said the same thing with early childhood grades. We did see that attendance was better for our high school students. They were able to maybe engage more, but we also know that the Wi-Fi capabilities needed to support multiple students in a home online was not where it needed to be. While our charter schools did supply laptops and hotspots where needed, there were still many limits. Moving forward, what does the future look like? We have a two-phased approach that we're proposing right now. Our first, for these next 2 years, we're proposing to collect growth data, in which we are calling transitional growth data collection. This is new for us to collect. We've never collected student level school assessment data for all students where it's possible. We are going to focus mainly on normative national assessments such as NWA MAP, iReady, or similar assessments. And we're hoping to collect it for each of the next 2 years. This next year will be baseline data. We're not expecting actually to use it for our accountability decisions because we want to see where schools are at and we want to see where the national data is at. And we don't want to make decisions that could be harmful or in public discussion that don't actually align with the data. So for school year 22-23, the following year after next year, that will be the first time that we are proposing using that data to hold schools accountable. We're still ramping in what that looks like, and we have a proposal that lists how the data will be used for each school in their reviews or renewals. And we know it's not the same as where we were pre-COVID. We are also working to revise our accountability system. We were probably going to do this anyways, and this allowed us the opportunity to make the changes that we're kind of excited to make moving forward. We want to include more school-based assessment. We want to look at a different variety of measures that are more holistic and not just based off the state assessment. So I think this downtime in assessment data has given us the opportunity to really dig into what our accountability system can be and then relaunch that in about 3 years. We don't have much determined yet. We're engaging all of our stakeholders at this point, but we're really hoping in the next year to have a framework that we are proposing to our board to put in place. So that's it for the Public Charter School Board in DC.
Thank you, Erin. That was really helpful.
Yeah, sorry about that. Jason, why don't you share with us the same three and we'll go from there, and next time I'll be on my mute.
So good morning, everyone. My first disclaimer, in addition to being Jason Sarsfield, I know many of you on the call, I saw the participant list, so it's good to see a lot of friendly names. My first disclaimer is I'm on vacation and I'm off the grid. And so I came to a spot where I get a good signal, but the wind picked up. And so I apologize in advance if you hear wind and or birds in my background. I was trying to do the noble thing and be available while on vacation for this important discussion. And I guess that's the consequence. So thanks, Sarah and Dave, for hosting and convening this discussion. Jason Sarsfield, Deputy Director, Central Michigan University's authorizing team. And we charter 57 schools with about 70 plus buildings across Michigan. We are one of many authorizers in Michigan as a public university. And collectively, the schools that we partner with serve 28,000 students. We've been at this work for 25 years as an organization, and some things kind of put us in a position, I think, early on to around collection of data to have some real value add. So we have a long-standing history of 20 years or so working with NWEA. All of our schools utilize it. It's what we lean on most heavily in our academic accountability system. And we've collected the student level data for years and years and years and have robust capabilities in terms of disaggregating that, looking at trends. And I'll talk a little bit about that when we get into learning loss as well. We also use the statewide system as well in our accountability system. And that is in Michigan, the M-STEP in grades 3 to 8, and then a combination of SAT and PSAT at the high school level. And so we use a combination of the two, but again, particularly for grades 3 to 8, we lean more heavily and always have on the NWEA assessment. And so what happened in March of 2020, we all know what happened, and like schools, we had to pivot as authorizers. So many of the things I'm going to share echo what Aaron had shared, maybe with some nuances and maybe regional differences. And so we really stopped assessments. We didn't require NWEA in the spring, took it off the table. Statewide assessments were canceled. So we, as with across the country last spring, we pretty much, had an absence of data. Moving into this year, executive orders and state laws required actually that all schools across the state administer a benchmark assessment the first 9 weeks of school and then before the last day of school. And so we kind of pivoted into a position of supporting our schools in terms of utilizing NWEA to fulfill that requirement, and help them understand what they can and can't do, and approving of learning plans, which was required by executive orders and laws. And so we really stopped accountability for last spring and this school year and pivoted to more support in using the data and understanding the data and complying with a myriad of state expectations and requirements. However, moving into this year, we're proud to have maintained our site visit process and protocol. All of our scheduled site visits went well this year, and we did virtual ones, we did in-person ones, and we did hybrid ones. So mirroring what schools did, and we're proud to have that qualitative data point, because I think we all know that has become increasingly important given the lack of quantitative data. So when it comes to learning loss, we were able to do a fall-to-fall comparison across our portfolio, much like NWEA has done. And we found almost identical results, meaning reading scores were relatively flat. And again, this is fall to fall, so a lot more to come when we collect and analyze spring data. And I think that's what we're all waiting on to inform what happened and how we move forward. But in math, quite significant declines across the board, particularly in the lower grades. Again, we've heard a lot about that. Almost every school in our portfolio, and as well as at the aggregate, performed better than the COVID projections. As Dave mentioned, those COVID projections essentially assume no instruction for not just the summer, but 5 months. And so not surprisingly, our schools all really outperformed those projections. Students of color, economically disadvantaged students were impacted slightly more across the board in terms of negatively, again, particularly in math. One additional point on the learning loss is that what we found in our data set is much more variability than in typical years. So you can look at that kind of average number across your portfolio with a large data set, but when you start looking at the variability across the portfolio, it was significantly higher. So kind of scores all over the place when you really look at a granular level. As we move forward, like I said, we're really excited to get our hands on the spring data across the portfolio. The state assessment this year is still on, but there's no participation requirement. So we do anticipate a lot of schools not testing. A significant number of students is going to, I think, decrease the value of that data. But I think we're looking at is some of the measures that we have in our accountability framework will be more relevant moving into next year. No surprise, our growth measures, because obviously there's fall to spring, will be more relevant, and we'll focus likely more on those as we kind of then look at what's our new normal. And I think Aaron alluded to this, which is really resetting based on the analysis of spring data and trend data, of what our achievement metrics might look like as we move forward, but really doing that in a thoughtful way and looking at kind of the reality of what happened. Last thing I'd say is when we look forward, we're really positioning to look at learning recovery now and not learning loss. And I think that's going to be an exciting journey to consider, especially when you think about NWEA's kind of characterization of gainers, maintainers, and sliders. I mean, some of you may have heard that. And some of those students who were sliders or who were most negatively impacted by the pandemic, at what rate do they recover and under what conditions? And I think we're in a position, because we've collected that student level data for a long time, to undertake some of that work. And again, looking forward to recovery and not loss. I'll end there.
Thanks, Jason. Just one clarification on that. When you were talking about what you've observed in the data about learning loss and some specific subgroups, is that specific to NWEA data, or are there additional data sets that you're relying on in order that reflect some of that same information?
That's just NWEA.
Okay.
And the absence of state data. I did see an early question around how do we know if virtual has been effective, right? There's not a lot of data, especially because this was the first time a lot of schools have gone down that path. And one of the challenges with that is we really pushed NWEA to have a virtual flag of sorts, so we knew which students were virtual and which weren't, and they were unable to do that. So I think the folks at the school level are going to be really positioned to disaggregate that data, because they're going to know which kids under which circumstance for which periods of time. And I think that will be very fruitful when you look at individual school effectiveness, but also across a portfolio.
All right. Thanks a lot for that. Chancey?
Great. Well, my picture was also from when I had hair, Dave. I'm Chancey, and I am one of the co-founders at Purdue Academy. We're in our 8th year of operation. We started with, we're very fortunate to have Dave on our board. We started with 60 kindergartners in 2013, and we now have almost 800 students across 2 campuses. We're a small network still. Let's see, the assessments that have been traditionally a part of our network, of course, MCA, our Minnesota State Assessment. NWEA, we have always given 3 times a year. And then Ames Web, we've given 3 times a year for all students, and then more frequently for interventions. And then, of course, our curriculum assessments. And we have at times used interims as well. And so I think we're one of the schools that has on the side of too much data, where we're constantly trying to refine, like, what are the most important pieces of data. So COVID has definitely made us do that. Changes since March. We didn't assess, like, I think this is pretty common. We didn't assess with NWEA last spring. We had intended to and just felt it to be kind of too overwhelming for our operational team at the time. But committed to assessing using NWEA this year, even if we were in distance. So we did give the NWEA assessment in fall, and we're going to give it in spring. We skipped the winter just because of the lift of testing. There were a lot of changes that went with that. As I'm sure all of you know, it's very difficult to assess students over Zoom. So we did Ames Web assessments and end of unit assessments. We would sometimes, I think I heard someone else say this here, a parent in the background saying, no, it's A. And so, so it has been in a really cool way, kind of opened up more dialogue, I think, between families to kind of like explain when work needs help and when something's an assessment, kind of what the difference is, because a family in the background doesn't necessarily know it's an assessment happening. So we did a lot of pre-work with the NWEA. That was a huge change in the fall. We actually didn't take it until, I think, late October, the very end of the window. We worked with individual families to make sure they understood how to proctor the assessment. and then did training with either a family or some kind of family member or an older person in the household. And then gave the assessment 2nd grade through 7th grade. We don't have 8th graders yet. And for the most part, felt really good about the data, that it seemed accurate, seemed aligned with where students were before. Of course, there were a couple outliers, but for the most part, I think all that pre-work helped the data feel somewhat accurate. So we are interested to see what those results look like. That leads me to learning loss, I think. Obviously, this is still difficult, you know, as other people have mentioned. We have the NWEA predictor. We don't often look at fall to fall. We generally look at fall to spring at our school, but we did look at fall to fall since it's what we had from this past fall. And definitely saw the same learning loss that was predicted in reading. We saw a better, a little bit higher in math, so less of learning loss than what was predicted. Again, however, that was fall to fall. So we're interested to see kind of what our fall to spring looks like. And then we've just continued to see gaps in Ames Web. I think we found teaching phonics over Zoom has been really, really difficult, especially for our youngest learners. They're now back in person, but our kids actually didn't go back to in-person learning until April. So the vast majority of the year we were online. So we are, and then I think we've with that transition kind of back and forth, as a lot of schools have seen, we felt like we got into a good rhythm with online learning. And then I think it was the right thing to move to in-person, but we saw a lot of learning loss because we have to do kind of planning days in between, like the reshift to teaching what it looked like in person. We'd have too many COVID cases. We have to go back online, reshift, do some planning. So I think we're concerned about the learning loss kind of that's happened through that process, just kind of inevitably. So we'll be interested to see what these results look like in June, in a week. All right, performance model. Let's see. Yeah, changes in store for future academic measures and performance. Without underrepresenting how difficult this year has been, like it's obviously been insanely difficult for everybody. It has pushed us to get stronger in a lot of ways. And while I wouldn't choose to have a year like this, I am excited about some of the changes it's made us think through. And some of those are programmatic and some of them are kind of bigger picture. Like it's made us step back and really think through like the school versus network autonomy. We've had to make so many fast decisions. And so that's given us a lot of reflection on how do we make decisions as an organization and really like stamp those things. So I think it's leaving us with better clarity across the board. And then the same with family communication. We have, of course, constant communication with families, but that's regular. They expect conferences to come out. They expect, family nights. But this was trying to get information from a lot of families really fast. And so I think it's made us think through, we have multiple schools in one building. So how is communication consistent with families? How can we better support it so that it's, the easiest possible access? So we have some work to do there. And then programmatically, it's pushed us, of course, it's pushed all of us to be innovative and rethink what we've always done in a way that innovation is something that our school has always valued, but I think is really difficult, like, to actually live. And I find that like teacher has an innovative idea and you're like, is that going to make it worse or is that going to make it better? So I think that this has forced us to try a few new things. And there's a few things that we'll be bringing with us. One example being we use Securely to be able to see what's happening on a student's screen during the school day so that we can message them, get back on the math program, which worked wonders. Like everyone's on the math program. So one of our principals is like, well, why wouldn't we do that during the school day? Because we have students with the teacher and students on the computer. So I think there's things like that have made a shift. We have one on like Paradoc is one that we use where a teacher in real time can see student work online. And so that's another example. So those are, I think, things that we're looking kind of big picture change programmatic. And then as far as assessments, we're looking very specifically at growth and naming the growth goals that we have, and are going back to our pre-pandemic growth goals during the pandemic, we had dropped our growth goal for NWA, for example, to 100% of projected growth, and now we're going back up to 135. So those are some, I think that I'll pause there for now.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah,
I'm
please.
just curious, as you're thinking about wrapping up the year and communicating your learning loss or your academic gains this past year, how are you thinking about communicating that to families and parents? Not even thinking about in an accountability sense, but just in the, like, how will you engage the community to say, like, look at what we've done. Like, it's been a tough year, but like, here's what we've done, and like, we're proud of it. So can you speak to that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we normally have a ceremony at the end of every year, which we're not doing because of COVID. So I think we've just been thoughtful anyway about what that communication looks like. One of the things that we're very cognizant of is making sure that families are understanding what is happening currently and what we're doing, which we're hoping looks like this. And at least in math has some early indicators that it might at least slightly outperform. So to try to show them kind of where the bar has been, and using some of this NWA data to say, you know, these are the trends we've seen. These are where our kids are. We're so excited to get back in person and like see that growth accelerated. So we're constantly trying to message like, here's where we are, and keep your students with us through 8th grade, and this is where we think they can be. But that's a great question. I certainly think that that's something that we still need to hammer out exactly what that messaging looks like and how. You usually show graphs. That's like, it's a harder thing to like, you know, not do in a PowerPoint. So that will definitely be a challenge, but I'm glad you brought that up.
Thank you.
I appreciate the optimism, right? So like finding where is the hope, or where are the lessons learned and things. Chancey, that's great. Actually, Aaron and Jason, are there any like positive surprises that you've noticed through this process when looking at data or adjustments or innovations with the schools that you work with?
So a couple things. So yes, I think there's been a few schools that have found success more quickly than you know, virtually than others. And I think some of those schools that were really positioned well to pivot were those schools that already utilize technology effectively, of course, but also Chancey alluded to like constant communication with families. So I think the schools that already had existing practices in place for really sound, clear, and you know, really predictive communication with their parents were able to leverage those systems and be more seamless than those that may not have had as strong a practices around parent communication. I think it's caused schools in the sector to really rethink the role of parents, including supporting parents and learning where their kids are, as Chancey had indicated, but also giving them tangible tools to help their own children learn, and essentially extending the school day by doing so. So, you know, across 57 schools, lots of different variation, but some schools really struggled. Others want to continue a virtual option, like, you know, many we're seeing with many. And so surprises, yes, on the positive, and then some real struggles as well, of course.
Great. Aaron?
I was just I mean, everything Jason said is relevant to what we're experiencing. The other note I'd add to that is a strong leadership communication plan. So a lot of schools realize that, I think Chancey even alluded to this, like, how do we make decisions? And a lot of their schools who pulled in a very diverse group of planning for reentry and for reopening and for recovery, I've seen just a more cohesive plan coming back, and then they're able to communicate with parents better, and they're getting all the voices up front in making the decisions. And that seems to have been working very successfully for a number of our schools.
All right, that's really helpful. I just want to get to a couple of the initial questions that have emerged. There's some good ones that have popped up here. Steve in New Mexico posed a question about online learning and some schools wanting to continue in full or partial form and things like this. So before we really look specifically at that question, I think one of the pieces that Authorizers and schools and departments of education, like everybody has a local context and there are different regulations regarding the method of education in which you employ, right? So some states require an e-learning certification or to be approved in order to be solely conducting that way, when many were required to do that, 12 months ago. And so now, like with lessons learned, like what Chancey was talking about, so some of the innovations, there are schools that are talking about how, whether it's deemed hybrid or not, like how to work with that. So first off, like the state agency, if there are regulations, according to that, there's policy that needs to be looked at, again, to consider that. From the perspective of charter school authorizers and charter schools themselves, I'm wondering first with the authorizers, whether or not your contracts get into material terms and whether or not that would ever touch in terms of the academic program, right? So when they go through a new school application process or go through renewal, they talk about what is the program that we're going to provide, right? And so you take that risk on authorizing the school based on what they say they're going to do. And so what they said they were going to do 3 years ago or 5 or 10 years ago may be completely different now from what the school is doing after the pandemic. There's always some evolution that occurs, but I'm wondering if you are making any material changes or you've been requested to make any material changes to your contracts when it comes to the method or the environment or the type of instruction.
So that's a loaded question with lots of probably parts to it. In Michigan, in March of last year, the executive orders required that schools get, extended learning plans approved by either their intermediate school district or their authorizer in the case of charters. And then also for this year, what governed this year was their, essentially their plan for this year, which also then had to be approved. And so because the law and the executive orders put us in that position, that essentially served as an amendment to the charter. And so kind of temporary, but at this point we are getting requests moving into next year to continue to offer virtual programs, which would require changes to their charters, but we are in limbo because we're waiting on the legislature to tell us what schools can and can't do from a seat time and other perspectives. So we're kind of in this trying to plan flexibly while, still being in a holding pattern of sorts. I think, from my observation, not every school in the state of Michigan is positioned to effectively offer a virtual option long-term, but some schools are. So I think, teasing out which schools are ready or have the capacity to do that, whether that's based on, an examination of data or qualitative measures, because there are, of course, ways to, as SchoolWorks well knows, to visit schools virtually, observe instruction. And so there's probably a combination of factors to kind of come into play, but it's really the intersection of practice and policy that I think we're really facing this, kind of friction, because we're waiting. I would anticipate in Michigan that schools will likely be required to provide an in-person option to all students next year, but may offer a virtual program. That's what we're expecting. And as a result, those schools that will want to continue to offer a virtual option will need to amend their charters if they don't already have a program such as that in there.
Erin?
This is a topic that hasn't been quite settled yet here. And I would say for this last year, all the charter schools had to create a continuous learning plan that was evaluated by the state superintendent and us to how they were educating students for this year. And that was last August, and a lot of things changed as they went into the school year. So, the schools had to make adjustments that were needed. Our mayor did say that schools will come back 5 days a week in person, and only students with medical exemptions will have virtual options. And that seems somewhat consistent with the county surrounding Washington, D.C. But there are some schools that have found that programs being virtual or a subset of students having a virtual option has been really beneficial for those students. There's not every student who's ready to come back. So we're working through all those details and what next year will look like. I would say that this last year, we said any school, teaching virtual, if it was a temporary thing, we didn't need to do charter amendments. We are now looking toward next year and beyond, where if any school wants a permanent virtual program, they do have to do a charter amendment. It states in our charters, whether they have a virtual full-time program, which we do have one online virtual charter school, or if they have portions of their program that is virtual, because we want to make sure that the education that the students are getting and that the school is providing is as quality as the in-person option the school has too. So it is a full evaluation process for us internally, and it's then voted on by the board before the charter is amended. So we would be going through charter amendments. I think, we're getting questions from some of our schools. As far as a permanent virtual option, the most questions seem to be coming either from some high schools, our alternative high schools, and our adult education schools. So I think we may see kind of a focus in some area. We also don't want to stop the innovation that schools have found what they have been successful. So we're really trying to kind of figure out all those pieces. I don't know, to your question, Dave, if we've been asked to make a material change to our charter to allow more flexibility. I just don't know that at this point.
All right, thanks for that. So there's a specific question from, like I said, Stephen, New Mexico. He's clarified here in which he's saying, like, in order to take the risk to go to hybrid or to exclusively online, what type of data folks are relying on in order to justify that particular change. So I guess if any of you want to weigh in on that, what you would consider in the absence of statewide assessment data, right? So these people are saying we want to do either comprehensive or partial programmatic change and what to rely on. I'll just start with, Jason alluded to it before, and we've had conversations about the absence of standardized data. A lot of organizations, whether they be networks, districts, states, are starting to consider more qualitative data and programmatic data. And so, like, whether you rely on specific school reviews to look at what are the systems in place, what's the quality of instruction, and whether it be solely in person or in a hybrid sense, SchoolWorks has been able to transition our on-site reviews to completely online or virtual reviews so that we can observe classroom instruction in that type of environment. And so the point of all of this is that that is some evidence that people can rely on with whatever high stakes decisions there, or to complement some of the other evidence that they're accumulating when faced with some of these unique challenges. Wondering if any of you, like Chancey, what would be the argument that you would make? What data would you present in order to justify that programmatic change? Or Jason or Aaron, like, what type of information would you need in order to justify making that change?
Yeah, we're really struggling with that. I mean, and not to make a programmatic change, even just to figure out whether we should continue to offer an online option for families. We want to do that, especially if a family is worried about, until they can get vaccinated, whatever, but I think our principals are struggling because they have felt that part of the reason the program wasn't so strong as it could have been, was because of all the different planning they had to do. They had to constantly 3, 4, 5 different plans, hybrid, in person, this version, that version. And so I think they're so worried about closing the gap that they're concerned that if they split their time and even think a little bit about getting some students online, that it's going to take away from the focus of closing the gap with kids. So I think we're really, and then of course, I think we don't feel like we have data that shows that this is, our biggest hope is that we're just not widening the gap this year. Like, that's not a good goal. And so I think our concern is that online, for the most part, it would be, we don't have data yet to show that we should be pushing that as an option for kids, while also recognizing there were some kids who really did excel. Like, we have a few examples of kids whose scores increased. So I think more we're thinking, like, how can we replicate whatever happened there in the classroom rather than how do we continue online? But we're struggling with that.
All right, thanks.
I think, go ahead, Aaron, I'm sorry.
Oh, thanks. To Stephen's question, we don't have a set rubric, but we are reevaluating how we would be approving online programs, whether it's a full program or a portion of a program being virtual, because we do want to see evidence that the quality of education is just as strong as the in-person option. And so that's been internal discussions we've been having. We don't have like a set like cut point in data we would want to be seeing, but I think that is evolving as our conversations keep moving forward to see if we should approve full-time or permanent online options. We also do qualitative site reviews, not as often. For some schools, depending on performance, it could be as few as one every 5 years. We did do them virtually this year, and that was really helpful and really gave us a lot of good information on how a school was, how classroom instruction was going on. So that I think would also be part of, we would continue to do that for any online program, but that would also be part of maybe our approval process.
Got it.
Yeah, I'd say we're largely qualitative in these considerations, and we've authorized full cybers now for a number of years. So that actual experience of oversight and accountability with cybers has, I think, taught us a few things that's positioned us well in this area. I think Chancey underscores the dilemma a lot of school leaders are in around a virtual option next year, which is if we don't offer a virtual option, we may lose some kids. And because they may not want to come to in person for whatever reason. And school leaders are the only ones that really know where their families are and you know, to what extent, obviously there's demand for continuation of remote. I would say though that to me, what would be compelling from a data perspective is if a school was able to show disaggregated data around their virtual kids this year and even compare them to their kids that were in person if they had that. But at the end of the day, that's really messy business right now because it's not that I don't trust school leaders, but it really is reported in that disaggregation. And so from a system standpoint, you know, Steve, it would be very difficult to set a common standard and then have data that aligns with that. Just the realities of how we've operated and some of the infrastructure that's in place and not in place.
Mm-hmm. All right. Sarah, any questions that you have at this point?
I don't think so. I've jotted a few down, but I think they've answered them all. They've spoken.
Yeah, so there was a question, actually, Bridget from New Mexico as well, where New Mexico is representing well today, was asking specifically about performance framework and whether or not there are material changes to contracts in order to make some of these changes. So starting with the authorizers, like what is the formal legal process you're going about in order to adjust the data set in which you're relying on and or the goals?
It's going to be, we have to tackle that mountain of a project. So in every one of our charters, it says how the school will be evaluated every 5 years. And the school can either choose our performance management framework, or they can choose individually negotiated goals, which have targets that they need to meet, both of which potentially right now come into question as we evaluate schools in these next couple of years post-pandemic. We will need to amend charters so that we're accurately reflecting the new requirements at the time of their next review. I see us doing this in chunks with schools coming up next year, then the schools year after. In some cases, it needs to be a public hearing and then a vote the following month, and we have to notice it. So these are multi-meeting processes for us to get a charter amendment. And in some cases, if it's a minor update and they're just aligning with the policy that has already explained the change, as I said, we have this transitional growth data. It is now that policy is going through our board process, approval process. So if that's the case, it may be as easy as a one-time vote for a school at a board meeting to amend their charter. So it depends on the change, but we have 68 LEAs with charter contracts that potentially at this point would need to be amended. And even if a school's individually negotiated goals, we find that the data coming out after a baseline year, the targets might need to be adjusted. That would have to go through that amendment process too.
Yeah, so a bit different in Michigan. Our trustees delegate to our office the authority to enter into contract amendments. So it's much more streamlined in that sense. our accountability framework is pretty standard across most of our schools, except for alternative schools potentially. And we use a variety of achievement and growth measures. And we call it a framework often, right? Because we don't have an exact formula. We don't have hard and fast absolute targets typically, and we apply that framework within the context of the school. And so we do have probably more flexibility than Aaron has, and we haven't had to amend the contracts because some of those measures still apply. It's more a matter of transparently and clearly communicating with our schools and the boards that oversee them around expectations. And again, like moving into next year, the growth measures are much more relevant and applicable, obviously, than the achievement measures. But we're still grappling with, at what point, much like Aaron, will we need, based on, again, our analysis of the Springs data and looking at trends, what might be the new normal or transitional types of types of measures that may or may not need to be amended into the contracts. And if so, we would likely then amend them wholesale across all of our schools in the way that we typically do for other standard changes that we do on a regular basis.
Okay, that's helpful. I kind of want to start to get down to kind of closing here, as this has been a great conversation. We've had a lot to talk about. I'm wondering, like, in terms of challenges and opportunities, I think in terms of charter schools and authorizers, like, things ultimately lead to renewal. Aaron, you were talking about like adjusting contracts that, but even going into the decision-making process, like what you're considering, whether or not you're diversifying some or looking more closely at some other information or relying on teams a little bit differently. Chancey, in your case, like, how do you represent your successes, like through a renewal application or just advocacy to your authorizer? How are you all approaching that, whether hypothetically that would be right now or a year and a half down the road? And what are some of the challenges you face in kind of stating your case from a charter school's perspective of, like, we've done our best, in fact, we've done a great job. And from an authorizer's perspective, like, we need to make an informed decision going forward, even though we have less information than we traditionally do. Chancey, you first. Like, how would you represent your successes in a different way?
Yeah, that's certainly a good question. I think that we're, again, constantly thinking about what the bar is for this year. So, Dave, we've had some data come in that we were less than pleased about. And then in comparison across the board, our data was like strong. So I think that we want to do two things. We want to represent where we are in comparison to what is happening during COVID. And then I also think we need to be candid and ground that in like where we should be. Because I think that this is like, and I think it's hard to do both, right? Like, we want to show how well this went, while also, I guess I just repeated it, grounding it in that comparison, because I think that our goal still has to be to get our kids back up to where we wanted them to be. And so I think communication that makes those two pieces really clear is what we're trying to go for.
All right. Thanks. Aaron?
So the question being, how are we going to evaluate schools in the next few years?
Are you adjusting your process? Are you focusing more on other pieces of data? Are you consulting with different people in order to help you make these tough decisions? Because you've never faced renewal in a similar way.
Very true. We are adjusting our process. So part of what I talked about is our, it's called the COVID-19 impact policy that I have laid out, this transitional goals plan. And what it has is every year for the next 3 years, and we stopped at 3 years because of where we are right now. We just don't want to go too far out, but we've laid out how we're going to evaluate a school. And we've tried to provide options for schools to show that they are meeting their goals. So that might not be the exact set of goals in their charter, though that will be considered. We would also like to consider this transitional growth data and some other information that we have as part of this process. So a school can meet it maybe one of 3 ways. And that, I think, coming out of this situation is for us is ideal. So there's flexibility. even with the transitional growth data, I haven't set specific targets schools need to meet because I wanted to be able to evaluate the data and look at grade band data and subgroup data and compare it to what we're seeing nationally in the trends for the next couple of years to have some flexibility with how we're evaluating schools. I'm talking to anybody I can about what they're doing to figure out how we can do it better. So I think some people on this call from SUNY I saw signed up, talked to them a week or two ago to hear what they're doing. I was excited to hear what Jason's doing, talking to some other authorizers just to see how are they moving through this process, to see what I can kind of glean from them to help improve how we're managing our next couple of years. So that's really been my go-to to try and figure this out.
Great, thank you. Jason?
Yeah, boy, if I had the answer to that question. So I'll give it a shot though. We apply our framework in a holistic way. And so, our most recent round of reauthorization, we call it, instead of renewal, it's mostly characterized as, were pretty straightforward decisions because they lacked one data point really, which was last spring. And most of those schools had some pretty clear trends and patterns coming up to it. So, and then of course we take into consideration our collective site visits and the evidence we glean from that, and again, in a holistic kind of way. One thing we did do differently this year that I think holds real promise moving forward is we took a pilot of those schools that we were working with this year and scheduled some really deep conversations around looking back and looking forward that we hadn't done in the past. We obviously did that virtually, and that included various members of our team as well as the school leadership and representation from the board, and really asked them how they saw their own performance, as well as pieces of information that we may not have. And I certainly don't think that we went into it with like knowing exactly what we wanted to hear, but that process educated us around some of the things that schools were using to reflect upon, but also it just valued our partnership. It furthered our partnership with boards and school leadership teams to kind of stop and reflect together and have some really rich dialogue. So even if we don't change our measures, I do anticipate that we will continue to make that a process, a part of our process as we approach and work through reauthorization as really a seminal opportunity to, as we would say, renew the partnership with the schools that we charter.
That's great. I really appreciate this, and I want to honor everybody's time and not go beyond the top of the hour. One of the things that I just requested of the panelists is for them to drop their email addresses into the chat. So if any of you have specific questions, their information is in their title, and their organization is in the invite, so you can very easily find them on the web to reach out and contact them. But if you want to lift an email address, feel free to grab it from the chat there. But I just really want to thank all of you for sharing and kind of digging in deep on this. Extremely challenging, filled with a lot of kind of creative opportunities to solve this. We're always honored to be able to have these conversations and hear about it. I echo what Aaron was sharing, just about any opportunity to engage in these conversations, because very smart people are all looking at this and all trying to solve it, and no one really has the perfect answer. And so we all have to rely on each other in order to beg, borrow, and steal and take little pieces. But I appreciate your willingness to kind of share, every little piece of it that is your struggle. And, it sounds like you have some really good ideas moving forward. Any last pieces of wisdom from anybody, given what we've all talked about?
I'd say to Chancey and to all the other school leaders on the call, thanks so much for all you've been doing. Us authorizers, yes, we've had to pivot, but nothing even close to what you've experienced. So on behalf of all the families and the kids that you serve, what we've witnessed across the country in terms of heroic leadership has really continued to make a difference in students' lives. And so, I appreciate Chancey's optimism for the future, and hopefully there's things that we can, take from this challenging time and apply to make, the experience for kids even better. So just wanted to give a shout out to school leaders across the country.
Fantastic.
I was just gonna say, Jason, I couldn't have said that better.
All right. Thanks, everybody. And I hope that you're all wrapping things up and able to kind of call the end of the year, even though that doesn't really mean anything. Everybody's work continues, but you're able to perhaps get outside like Jason is and walk into those woods sometime soon. But thanks for taking the time. Really interesting conversation, and look forward to hearing from all of you at some other point. Bye now.